The 1872 presidential election was one of the weirdest elections in our history. So Ulysses Grant was running for re-election, and he had been involved in these scandals that I mentioned in the last video. And so there were some people in his party that were starting to want to distance themselves from him and kind of to run as different Republicans than the Grant Republicans. So the Republican Party is kind of splitting, and the Democrats actually kind of latched on to this split off Republican Party to try to gain enough votes to be able to defeat Grant. So this liberal Republicans, which was the split off group, ran a guy named Horace Greeley, who was a newspaper editor, and the Democrats mostly kind of supported him as well. But what happened was, after the votes were cast, well, Grant had still actually won the popular vote. So even the fusion of the liberal Republicans and the Democrats weren't enough to get Horace Greeley the votes he needed. But after the popular vote happened in November, but before the Electoral College actually voted in December, which is usually just a formality, it doesn't really matter, except during that month between November of the general election and December when the Electoral College cast their ballots, Horace Greeley died. It's the only time that a presidential candidate has died in the midst of the election season, like before the Electoral College met. So the electors who had been pledged to Horace Greeley cast ballots for all these different people, and you can see in the map here that a lot of different people got electoral votes. So it was a really just weird election, but in the end, Grant got reelected. But here's the important part. The Republican Party is splitting, and we see that with this kind of offshoot liberal Republican Party that's formed. And who benefits when a party splits? The other party does. So the Democrats are actually gaining power and getting stronger because the Republicans are fracturing and weakening. So back to that idea of redemption, Southern Democrats trying to regain power and control in government. If they can manage to get enough Democrats in government, they can get Reconstruction to end. Keep in mind that Democrats, and especially Southern Democrats, do not like Reconstruction because Reconstruction is harsh on the South. The martial law is going on in the South. All these programs and laws that have been giving more rights to the former slaves have been going on. So Democrats want Reconstruction over, and they are growing in power. So turn the page. Then in 1873, there's an economic panic. It basically involves around debts and with the railroad companies, which then trickled down the line into other businesses and workers and investments and banks and all kinds of stuff until basically we have a widespread economic depression that lasts for 5 years. And there were bank failures, and there were issues about the currency circulation and how much money should be in circulation. The important thing about this is anytime there's an economic problem in the country, it takes precedence over everything else. When people are out of work and people are out of jobs, they don't necessarily care about all the other political stuff that's going on. They care about the economy. And so an economic panic causes Reconstruction to be put on the back burner, and all of the programs and supports and all that stuff that Reconstruction had was taking place in Reconstruction are now kind of fading away in the public mindset. And there are a few Supreme Court cases also during this era that you don't really need to know the specifics of, but they involve the new amendments that have been passed regarding rights for the former slaves and for African Americans. The 13th Amendment had abolished slavery. The 14th Amendment established citizenship for all people born in the United States, which was intended to refer to African Americans, former slaves. They were born in the United States, so they were citizens. And the 15th Amendment was intending to grant voting rights. Now, here's what happens. The Supreme Court basically rules that some of these amendments didn't really mean what they were intended to mean. Now, you don't have to know each of these cases, but the Slaughterhouse case basically says the 14th Amendment only gives U.S. citizenship. It doesn't give state citizenship. Like, they might be a citizen of the United States, but they're not necessarily have to be considered a citizen of North Carolina, which means that North Carolina could deny them basic rights as citizens within the state. The Cruikshank case says that the 14th Amendment doesn't punish anybody who doesn't give rights to people. For example, if someone denies rights of citizenship to an African American person, what happens to them? Well, there's no punishment if someone discriminates. So basically it's saying there can be no enforcement of the rights that everyone should have, because there's no way to actually punish people who oppress other people. Now here's this last one I think is really interesting or important to know as well, which is the U.S. versus Reese case, which, if you remember back when I said what the 15th Amendment was, I said that it says that the right to vote cannot be denied because of one's race, color, or previous condition of servitude. That's the quote of the amendment, that the right to vote cannot be denied because of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. It does not say that all men are allowed to vote. It says that the right to vote can't be denied because of race. And that's what this Reese case basically establishes. So it's providing basically a loophole around the right to vote by states being allowed to deny the right to vote for other reasons besides just race. They could implement a poll tax, for example, and say if you couldn't pay the poll tax, then you can't vote. Well, you weren't denied the right to vote because of your race, but because of your inability to pay a tax. But what this did was essentially take away the right to vote from African Americans, largely because they tended to not have money, being former slaves. The literacy test, which said the right to vote could be denied because you can't read. Well, it's not because of race, it's because you can't read. But African Americans weren't allowed to learn how to read, so it was a way of stopping them from voting. And then there was this interesting clause called the grandfather clause, and you've probably heard of it, but it's one of the more misunderstood things that I've found, which is that people think that it means, well, it says that if your grandfather could vote, then you could vote. And specifically, the grandfather clauses of this era mentioned voting in 1860. And so what that means is who could vote in 1860? Well, only white men could vote in 1860. So what the grandfather clause did was say that it didn't necessarily keep African Americans from voting, because that's what the literacy tests and poll taxes did. What the grandfather clause did was say that white people who couldn't pay the poll tax and white people who couldn't pass the literacy test could still vote because their grandfather voted. So what the grandfather clause did was allow poor illiterate white people to still vote, whereas poor illiterate black people couldn't vote because their grandfathers had not voted in 1860. So I'll come back to this in just a second, but what these Supreme Court decisions all did was basically undo a lot of the progress that had been made, giving rights and granting citizenship and voting rights to African Americans. These cases all came up with ways around actually having to give those rights in reality. So they all created loopholes. And so these cases basically took away a lot of the rights that the radical Republicans had been fighting for and trying to pass for African Americans. And so this is showing an end to these Reconstruction policies. So election of 1876, we kind of fast forwarded through Grant's second term there. This time the Republican running is Rutherford B. Hayes, and he's running against Samuel Tilden. This is a pretty weird election too. And in this election, Samuel Tilden won the popular vote, but there were some questions about some of the electoral votes, particularly in southern states. There was still some debates over whether certain states could have their electoral votes if they had been finally readmitted into the Union. And anyway, there were some disputed states, particularly in the Deep South. And so Tilden didn't have enough electoral votes in order to win. So if a candidate doesn't get enough electoral votes and nobody gets enough electoral votes, it goes to the House of Representatives to decide. Well, what ends up happening to decide this election, Hayes was the Republican, and Hayes did not win the popular vote, but the Democrats in Congress basically said they would let Hayes win. They would vote for Hayes, and Hayes could become president, even though he didn't win the popular vote, if he agreed to some conditions. First, if he removed the troops from the South. Remember the martial law that had been there since the Reconstruction Act of 1867, that if he would remove the troops from the South, if he would agree to appoint Southerners to his cabinet, and if he would pledge to invest money into transportation improvements, particularly for the South. You can't see the words for the South, it's behind my head there. But basically, if Hayes would give some concessions to the South, the Democrats in Congress would basically give him the election, even though he hadn't won the votes. And so he agrees to do these. And so Hayes ends up becoming the president. And this is called the Compromise of 1877, that Hayes would be president if he agrees to end Reconstruction, because removing the troops from the South would end Reconstruction, because that would be the official measure that Reconstruction is over. The troops have been withdrawn. And he also agrees to appoint Southerners and to improve transportation in the South. So all the troops are removed. Each state is given the right to govern itself again. This is called home rule. So they're allowed to kind of make their own rules and laws again, which they hadn't been while they were under federal kind of occupation. And Democrat redemption has been achieved. Like, the Democrats have their power back. And in the South, every Southern legislature was kind of flipped back to Democratic control. A lot of African Americans who had been in the legislatures in those states were pretty much swept out with the Democrats coming back into power. And for the next basically 100 years, the South, the Southern states, would be controlled by the Democratic Party, and would vote Democrat in elections. It doesn't change, and that's called the Solid South. It doesn't change until, and you probably know that much of the South now does not vote Democrat. It's more predominantly Republican. That doesn't change until about the 1960s, when you get to the Civil Rights era, and the Democrats become the party more in favor of civil rights, whereas the Republicans become the states' rights, don't have to follow the civil rights laws and stuff like that. And so that's when the South then switches to become more Republican. But you'll learn about that next year in American too. So this new South, there's no slavery, but there's still there are segregated facilities, and these are called Jim Crow laws, where everything was segregated. Most people think of schools and restrooms and stuff, but it was literally everything. Neighborhoods, waiting rooms for train stations, cemeteries, everything was segregated. I actually have a list that kind of just gives random, there are rules in states as to who could play games with each other, that you can't play dominoes, like white people and black people can't play dominoes or checkers together. There's all kinds of laws, and they're classified as Jim Crow laws in general, which were the segregation laws that basically force a separation between the races. And this is going to last until 1963-64 era with the Civil Rights Bill. I've already talked about the poll taxes, literacy tests, and grandfather clause. I'm about to run out of time for this video, so I will pause here and just start with this on the next one.